Holiness does not shield you from sorrow. It gives you someone to lash yourself to in the midst of sorrow. Right living before God is not this magical recipe for an easy life. If you're just joining with us, man, we're glad you're here this morning. We are just beginning a journey through the Gospel of Luke, a journey that's going to take us a long time, but a journey that I think will be well worth it in the end. We are only in chapter 1, just in verse 5 this morning, where we'll pick up in just a moment. Let me give you a number as we get started today. The number 400. 400 years. That's a considerable amount of time, especially when you consider and begin to think about what was actually happening in our world 400 years ago. That would be the early 1600s. 400 years ago, the English, the French, and the Dutch were just trying, not very successfully, mind you, but trying to start colonies on the eastern seaboard of what we now know as the United States. Jamestown itself, one of the earliest, began in 1606, 07, somewhere right in there. In 1610, Galileo saw the moons of Jupiter and began to notice the way things moved in the solar system. In 1611, many of you will know that one. If you like to carry a big Bible that's probably black, you know the number 1611 because that's when your King James Bible was first published in England. In 1616, Shakespeare died. In 1618, the 30-Year War started. In 1620, the Mayflower arrived on our shores. In 1625-26, New Amsterdam was founded, which later became New York. 1631, the Taj Mahal is built. That was our world 400 years ago. Now imagine, from then until now, you do not hear a single word or prophet from the Lord for that time span. It's 400 years. You have not heard from the Lord. From 1600 to now, the Lord has not spoken or given any voice to a new word to His people. That's the situation you find yourself in at the beginning of the Gospels. From the end of Malachi and his speaking and ministry to the beginning of the Gospels is 400 years of silence. And that's the situation we find ourselves in today. The silence being broken. But interestingly enough, in Luke's Gospel, he does not break the silence, and God does not break the silence with the arrival of Jesus, or even with the announcement of Jesus. No, instead we find ourselves with the announcement of a different child. And it's not even the child. And this isn't the first announcement of a child in the Scriptures, as Grant read for us this morning about an announcement in the Old Testament. And there were multiple ones of those in the Old Testament. But almost every time God does something like this and He announces a child to a couple who doesn't have a child, you're going to see this thing happen in Scripture where it's a really big deal. It's a big moment. Now, initially, this moment doesn't seem like much. Instead, it starts with a seemingly kind of unfortunate couple, yet in a way, isn't that typical of our God? Through this couple, God is going to do something extraordinary. And in this story, there is such hope and such an incredible way to continue to tell the story of what has been happening since the very beginning. Now, the beginning of this story, and starting in verse 5 all the way down to verse 8, is really, it's kind of a brief snapshot of what is really a sad story in the life of this couple and this huge moment that happens in their lives. So you've got a sad story and a huge moment in verse 5. Read with me, starting in verse 5. It says, "In the days of Herod, the king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah, and he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. Now, while he was serving as a priest before God, when his division was on duty. We'll just stop right there for a second. In verse 5, you get the introductions to this couple. You have this guy named Zechariah. He was of the priesthood of the line of Abijah. And that was not some important line that made him extra special, if some have speculated in history. Really, if in the divisions of the priesthood, Abijah was 8th down the list. But he does have a wife who does come from a priestly line. That was considered a special blessing. But we're going to see that their wedding and their marriage was not blessed with a child here in a moment. But their character becomes before their situation. And I want you to note that. Look at verse 6. It says their faithfulness is described in verse 6. It says, they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. Now, that righteous and blameless, that does not mean that they were sinless. A lot of times when we see that writing in Paul's language later on in the New Testament, you see that as sinless. That's not what he was saying here. It just says that they were a holy couple. They worked hard at being pious and blameless before the Lord. They were commendable. They were to be admired for their faithfulness to the Lord. It's a favorite theme of Luke to point out when people are walking blamelessly and when they're not. So we're introduced to this couple, Zechariah and Elizabeth, and we are told right off the bat that they are blameless and they are righteous. Yet, then you enter into verse 7 and we see the sadness of their story, the sorrow that comes in their story. It says, but they had no child. Now, why are those two verses linked together like that? They're linked together. They are righteous and they are holy and they are commendable before the Lord, but they had no child. Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. It probably doesn't mean that they were super old. It just well past the time in life that they were expected to have children. But there is no doubt that this created sorrow in their lives and souls. Anyone who has ever walked through infertility and not being able to have children knows well this sorrow of not being able to have a child. Elizabeth would say herself in verse 25, down towards the end of this story, that the Lord has taken away my reproach, my sadness, or my disgrace. He has taken that from me. Because what you see is in Jewish culture of this day, to be without children was a disgrace. It was often seen as punishment by God for their sin. No doubt there were glances. No doubt there were conversations that happened around them, especially with him being a priest. No doubt they caught a little bit of side eye from people here and there as to why they never had any children. And that only compounded probably the intensely personal sorrow that this couple experienced at every turn and honestly had probably given up on at this point in time in their life. But notice something here. Luke makes something very clear here. Their lack of a child had nothing to do with their sin or even any kind of punishment. Remember their character in verse 6. What were they? They were blameless in all the commandments and statutes. They were righteous before the Lord. Church, I want you to remember something very clearly. Holiness does not shield you from sorrow. It gives you someone to lash yourself to in the midst of sorrow. As we studied through lament over the last few days, we saw that just because someone was righteous before God does not mean that sorrow would never enter their life. And here we see that same theme present. This was a holy, righteous, and blameless couple before the Lord. And yet they were filled with deep grief and deep sorrow, even though they were holy and righteous. Right living before God is not this magical recipe for an easy life. I'm reminded of Jesus' words later in his ministry in John chapter 9. They're walking along and they see a man who had been born blind. And the disciples ask him, who sinned? Was it him or his parents that this man was born blind? That was a common theme in their mind. And Jesus answered them and said, listen, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. I think you could apply that same truth that Jesus lays out there to the situation of Zachariah and Elizabeth. It was not due to their sin that they had had no child. They had no child to this point so that the works of God might be displayed in them. Did Zachariah or Elizabeth know what God had for them through all of those early years of not being able to have children, when their friends and his work buddies and all of these people around them were having children and going through and experiencing all the things that they thought they were going to taste and see, and yet they look and they see, we're not having any of this? Did they know what God was going to do? Did they know the promises that were coming? Of course they didn't. Through their probably countless prayers and weeping and sadness, did they know? Not until God showed up. Sometimes it's like that. God is going to do something at some time. And the only thing we can do is just keep waiting and praying and trusting and walking with Him. And that's what they were doing. In verse 8, you can see what Zechariah's work was. There were a lot of priests. It says in verse 8, it says he was a priest before God. Read with me down to verse 10. He was a priest before God when his division was on duty. And according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense. Now, so this is Zechariah's work. We've heard about their character. We've seen the sorrow of their lives. But there's this moment that happens in the life of Zechariah. And it's not, there's a really special moment that goes on here before the angel of the Lord shows up. Watch what happens. In Zechariah's work, there was a lot of priests. Some will speculate there was up to maybe even 18,000 different priests that would serve before the Lord. They were split into divisions. As we said, he was of the group of Abijah, who was 8th down the list. And they would make the priests, they would divide, they scheduled it. They made sure that everybody didn't have to work all the time. And so these guys would go on. They were shift workers, essentially. And they would go in and they would do their priestly duties for their shift, and then they would go home. And while they were there, different priests would go in and burn incense before the Lord. So, this is the context here. These priests served around the temple, and remember the role that the temple held for the people. It was everything to them. All their worship was centered around here. So if you're a priest, you are in the central position of leading the people in worship and effectively praying for them and doing the work of the ministry on their behalf. During the morning and the evening prayers, one priest would be selected to go in before the Lord and burn incense and offer prayer for the people. Usually that prayer would be something along the lines of praying for the deliverance or the reconciliation of Israel. But remember, there had been no prophetic word from the Lord for 400 years. Just day and night, morning and evening. For 400 years, or not for that entire time that the temple wasn't there, but for the last while, they had been going in morning and evening to make these prayers and offer these prayers, and nothing was being spoken. But here's the incredible part. A priest was limited to burning incense only one time in his ministry life. He only got to do this once. Many never got to do it at all. So for him to be able to do this was probably the biggest moment of his priestly life. Perhaps, in his eyes, one of the biggest moments of his life, period, especially with not having a child. He very easily could have been thinking, I may never have a child, but I get to do this. All the other priests and the gathered crowd of worshipers would have been waiting outside, like it tells you in verse 10, leaving him alone to offer this burnt incense and probably waiting on him to come back out and complete the offerings and the liturgy that they would go through for the people. This was a holy moment for Zechariah, one he had probably looked forward to and hoped for. For many others gathered, it could have been a regular Tuesday, but for him, this was a major moment. But God is about to transform this whole moment from something that just was central to him to God's plan was being reinitiated and the silence was about to be broken. Look at verse 11 and read with me down to verse 17. It says, "And there, while he was doing this work and praying, there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, 'Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. For he will be great before the Lord. And he must not drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. He will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. He will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared.'" Now remember, again, 400 years, silence, and now an angel shows up. No voice, no prophet from the wilderness, but an actual angel of the Lord. To say Zechariah was troubled, that's probably an understatement in the translation. He was terrified. He had no category for how to minister and to offer prayers of incense when an angel of the Lord showed up. There's a running joke amongst preachers about when you become a pastor, how quickly you learn all the things they didn't teach you in seminary. And you learn a lot of it real fast. I'm betting angel of the Lord standing next to the altar of incense never came up in priestly school. Like it was not in the curriculum. But in verse 13, you can see the silence is broken and this plan is renewed. Verse 13 is the first confirmed words of the Lord in 400 years, and they come from someone who stands literally in God's presence. And they are, "Do not be afraid." You realize how many times God utters those words to his people? Over and over and over again. They constantly stand in fear of him, and he constantly has to remind us that we don't have to fear him like that. Yes, we fear him, but not like that. Not like he's going to out to get us or come to do us harm. And what does he say to him? He says, "Your prayer has been heard." Don't be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Now, what has been interesting about this is we don't know what his prayer was. We don't know if he went into this moment and he prayed for a child. We don't know if he went in like they normally would have and prayed for the reconciliation of Israel. Maybe he prayed for both. And what we're going to see is, in fact, God answers the prayer of both because he's going to do both. It really doesn't make sense for his specific prayer to be for a child because in verse 18, he acts like, "What are you talking about?" If he had been praying for a child and he says, "Your prayer had been heard," it would make sense that he would say, "Okay, that sounds great." But he doesn't do that. He acts shocked. But the prayer was probably a taught prayer for the reconciliation of Israel, which God, in fact, was doing. But if you haven't figured this out, God can do multiple things at one time. He can act in multiple ways and do multiple things. He can fulfill an intensely personal desire for Zechariah and Elizabeth and at the same time fulfill the need of a nation. In verse 13, he promises him a son. And this son is going to be named by God himself. What's interesting is that's not the normal practice. When John is born a little bit later, everybody's trying to name him after his dad. Maybe they were going to name him Bar John. That was a pretty common thing. There's a guy named Bartimaeus later in the scriptures in Jesus' ministry, and it literally means Bar is son of Timaeus. Maybe they were just going to go with Bar John. I think Bar Zechariah. I think John rolls off the tongue a little bit better. But we don't know the practice, but we do know that they were intending to name him this. And then Zechariah's lips are finally loosed a little bit later in the gospel, and we'll see that he says, no, he's already been named. His name is John. He already has another name, and it's given to him by God himself. Consider what that meant for Zechariah, though. All he'd ever wanted was a child, perhaps a son, to carry on his own name, carry on the family name. Yet now that's not going to happen. But the alternative, though, was this child was no regular child just meant to carry on the family name, become a priest like his dad. We're going to see here in a second exactly what this child is going to do. In verse 14, it says, you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice. Now, doesn't that seem kind of redundant? Why does he need to tell him that you will have joy and gladness? Of course they're going to have joy and gladness. They've been waiting on this day and this moment for years. This has been the longing of their heart. The reproach was going to be lifted and gone. Of course they're going to have joy and gladness. Why does he say that? I think he says it not so much because of the natural inclination of their heart, but because what comes at the end of that verse. He says, you'll have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. Not just because the joy, your reproach has been lifted from you, but because of verse 15. You will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice because of verse 15. See that 4 at the beginning of verse 15? That's going to give you the reasoning as to why you are going to have joy and gladness. For he is going to be great before the Lord. It just simply tells us why. You're not just going to be thrilled to have a child, and people will not just be happy for all the worldly reasons you have children. This child holds a unique place in the plan of God. He will be great before the Lord. In front of the Lord himself, he is going to be great. He's not just an answer to the prayer of two holy people. His greatness is before the Lord. Jesus himself says later in Matthew 11:11, truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has risen no one greater than John the Baptist. And in verse 15, you can see why he is great. One, his lifestyle is distinct. This is similar, this abstaining from wine and strong drink, that's similar to the vow of the Nazirite. And some have said that he was becoming a Nazirite at this point. I probably don't think that's the case because you don't have all the stipulations. It just means that he was supposed to be distinct and set apart. Later, this exact thing is going to be recognized in John's ministry. It made him set apart. That was the point of all along. But really, the critical piece of John's ministry and why he's going to be great before the Lord comes at the end of verse 15. Because it says, he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even from his mother's womb. Here is the most critical piece of John's life and ministry. To be filled with the Spirit is unlike any other. No one else has carried this descriptor quite like this. It's common later in Acts, but not here, and definitely not in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the Spirit seems to come and go upon people. It will land for a certain amount of time. And it may stay for a while, but then it will depart and lift. At no point have we seen the Spirit come and dwell on someone permanently, especially from their mother's womb. He comes here and he stays for good. In this, John stands as sort of a bridge between the work of God in the Old Testament and what he's going to do in the New Testament. Notice there's nothing, though, that John has done to deserve this. God just graciously has chosen him. And this is not the first time that this has happened. That God has graciously chosen a couple and given them a son and chosen that son to be important in his work. As Grant read for us this morning, but when God does do that, pay attention because he's going to do something. Verse 16 and 17 tell us of the work of John, what the work of John will be. If you look at it, he says, he will turn many of the children. He will go before him. That him is not talking about Jesus yet. It's talking about God himself in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared. What is he talking about there? He's going to turn people, turn the hearts, turn the disobedient to make ready a people for the Lord. What is all this a picture of? Well, John's work is going to be restoring that vertical relationship between people and God. Look at what he says. He will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord our God. Why? Think about that. Think about what he just said. Turn the children of Israel to the Lord their God. Why would the children of Israel need to be turned to the Lord their God? Wasn't he already their God? Well, we know that he wasn't because we know that they were not following him as they should. The whole ministry of Jesus is about that end. And he's come to bring fulfillment and bring reconciliation. And John the Baptist is paving the way for this. He's laying the groundwork and he's restoring and pointing back to the way the relationship is supposed to work between the people and the Lord. But he's not just doing that. He's also restoring horizontal relationships. Look how he says it. He will turn the hearts of their fathers to the children. And we're not sure exactly what he's pointing there, but we know those relationships are horizontal, of restoring those relationships towards one another, of bringing families back together potentially. And he's doing this through the work of truth. So that those who are disobedient to the wisdom of the just, so they will be restored to a knowledge of the truth and to get a people ready. That's the end. To prepare the way, to make ready a people for the Lord. This is why John is going to say later on in John's gospel, John the Baptist is going to say, he must become greater and I must become less. Because he's saying everything needs to point towards Jesus. Everything needs to go towards Jesus to make ready for the Lord. And then when you get down into verse 18, 19, and 20, you can see this incredibly human moment that occurs in his life, in the life of Zechariah. Look what happens. Zechariah said to the angel, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man and my wife is advanced in years." And the angel answered him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and bring to you this good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time." This verse 18, you see, it's really just an incredibly human moment. We never get it quite right, do we? When the Lord shows up, we often have something to say, and like Peter, rarely is it spot on. Occasionally, but not often. Why? Because we are human. We don't always see what God is doing. His question's natural, isn't it? How is this planning on happening? Not sure that we're still equipped for this. Mentally, physically, emotionally, all of it. We've kind of thought that ship had sailed. Everybody kept asking, Caroline and I, as all these other guys were having babies, "Are you next? Are you next?" I'm like, "No, we're done. Mentally, physically, emotionally, we're done. We're not going down that road." I wonder if Zechariah and Elizabeth sat there and was like, "Hey, we thought this was past. We thought this story was over." So it's a pretty natural question, isn't it? But you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of John 3. When Nicodemus comes and he's talking to Jesus, and Jesus says, "You got to be born again." What's Jesus say? Or what's Nicodemus say? How can a man be born when he's old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? He's thinking very naturally. How is this supposed to work? And Jesus basically looks at him and says, "You don't know what you're talking about. You should, but you don't." And the angel looks at Gabriel, or the Gabriel looks at Zechariah and says, "You don't quite get it." Now he shows him some divine grace here. He shows divine grace by actually answering the question, how's this going to happen? But the answer is essentially not the mechanics of it, but by whom it's going to happen. He says, "Listen, you don't really realize who I am, do you?" He slowly begins to redirect Zechariah's heart to the author of his message. He says it's not just that he is Gabriel. The marker of the moment was that he stands in the presence of God and he was sent to speak, and he was sent to bring you this good news. Who's the emphasis on there? Who's doing the work? It's God himself who's doing the work. This emphasis is on a holy moment from God to Zechariah through his angel. This child is not intended to be normal. He comes outside of normal timing for different purposes. Are you seeing a theme here? If John is preparing a way for something different, it's not just his preaching. It's his birth as well. He's laying the groundwork to show that God can bring about his promises however he so chooses. And the point is, he's going to keep them. He does give this measure of divine correction in verse 20. Because what was Zechariah lacking? He lacked belief. He lacked understanding. God wanted belief from him. He spoke and we believe. That's the pattern always. He didn't, so God graciously granted his promise through a bit of divine correction. Remember, God can do multiple things at once. He shows him that Zechariah wanted to know how God was going to work, so God gave him a sign and showed him. It may not have been the sign he wanted, but he did get a sign. He says, you'll be silent and unable to speak. Some say this meant as he was deaf as well as mute until that day. And why? Because you did not believe. That's always the case, isn't it? This is always the question. Will you believe? Think of all the questions you face in your life. Has God said something about those questions? The question is not, will he answer? The question is always, will you believe? And when you get to verse 21 through 25, you can see the story come full circle. In the course of the regular prayers and the burning of incense, a guy comes out and can't talk anymore. There was supposed to be a regular practice of what was happening here, but the story got around. I bet folks went home talking that day. Did you hear a guy saw a vision? Because they see, look at verse 21. And the people were waiting for Zechariah, and they were wondering at his delay in the temple. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them, and they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple, and he kept making signs to them and remained mute. And when his time of service was ended, he went to his home. And after these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she kept herself hidden, saying, thus the Lord has done for me in the days when he looked on me to take away my reproach among the people. Can you imagine how this conversation went when he got home? Zechariah is on shift work. Once his time is up, he went home. We have no idea how long he had left on his shift, but when he got home and he got to tell Elizabeth, I finally got to do it. I got to burn incense, and you will never believe what happened to me. I didn't believe it either, which kind of put us in this predicament. I can't really talk to you right now. Maybe you should believe it so you don't end up like this either. Of course, they didn't really have that discussion. He couldn't talk. What's Elizabeth thinking? Does he write it all down for him? We don't know. We're not given that. All we're given is verse 24. God has kept his promises. And verse 25, you will have great joy and you will have gladness. Do these lines not qualify as promises fulfilled? We're not told why she hides herself away, just that she does. Perhaps it was for a time of worship because of all that Zechariah had somehow communicated to her. We're only left to speculate. But there are things we can be clear on. Because of what God was doing, a plan was reignited. The silence had been broken. A prophet was on the way to make ready a people for the Lord. Zechariah was to believe. Elizabeth was to believe. We are to believe. God knows what he's doing, and he will keep his promises.